So sometimes on the Rejuvenate podcast, we have on controversial guests who have controversial opinions. Why do I do this? I certainly don't do it for the sake of controversy. I do it because I'm interested. I'm interested to hear their theories because I feel like they might be right, or at least, and this is often the case, they may be partially right, or they may have a point along with some of the stuff that's a bit out there. However, I have been accused a couple of times now, a few times in the comments and by email, of platforming people with dangerous ideas. Now, I don't really believe in that term. As far as I'm concerned, what I'm doing is having interesting conversations with people who may have a really good point about what it is that they're teaching. But I think the criticism that could be leveled at the podcast that is perhaps more fair is that I may be confusing people, bringing on people with different opinions who often are very good at stating them and explaining them and persuading you of them. And I don't always necessarily take a position. Now, the reason I don't take a position is not because I love to be a diplomat and sit on the fence per se. It's just because I don't want to act as an arrogant, I know everything better than everyone person. And so sometimes if it's an area that's outside of my, core focus, I will say, look, if this person's been studying this for the years, I haven't, I'm gonna listen to them. However, people have been asking me, well, and it's quite common in the comments, even for much older videos where I have these controversial guests on, what's your opinion on this? And I think that's a very fair question if you're, especially if you're following my podcast and watching or listening regularly. So in this episode, we're going to go through, and it originally came about because Chrissy was actually asking me questions about, oh, well, what do you think about this? And, was this person right? Or was this person right? And I was like, okay, and of course, since having those people on, many of them is a while ago now, I have had much more of a chance to study and put what they've recommended to practice and to do before and after testing with myself and other people, and to be able to gather evidence. And so that's what I wanted to do today, share with you my take on, and I hope I've remembered all of them, that Chrissy and I have remembered all of them between the two of us, all the things that may have confused you, or you may have felt like, I don't know what to make of this. I'll do my best to give you a hopefully helpful perspective on them.
Hello and welcome to the Rejuvenate podcast. I'm your host, Chrissy Hawks, and I'm here with my co-host, Elwyn Robinson, the creator and founder of Advanced Health Genetics, the Hormetics Weight Optimization System, and the author of the book series, The Rejuvenate Blueprint. And as he just described, we are discussing the controversial opinions, or maybe the confusing opinions that have come on the previous guests that have come on our show. So we are going to get Elwyn's take as he dives deep and we figure out what his opinion is on some of those guests. So lovely listeners, it's always a pleasure to have you with us. Please remember right now to click and subscribe so that you don't miss an episode of the podcast episodes that we're bringing to you. And also remember, supporting our sponsors helps support this podcast so we can continue to bring it to you free of charge. So with all that out of the way, now we're going to get into the good stuff. So Elwyn, we've had a few controversial guests on this, and then we're going to go through. What would you say, just off the top before we get into the questions about certain things, who would you say was our most controversial guest?
That's a good question. My opinion, or like what other people thought?
Let's do both. Your opinion and why, and what other people have thought and why.
Okay. Well, in terms of what other people thought, that's easy to answer. I think it's definitely based on just the feedback I'm seeing, Dr. Garrett Smith and Grant Genereux. Grant Genereux, because of his, very what's the word? Not just a perspective on something, but really applying it to the point that most people would consider dangerous. And of course, I'm going to address whether it actually is in this episode. But that's and then with Dr. Smith, he has probably a variety of different perspectives that people feel that way about. So yeah, I'd say those two just based on feedback. And I suppose Jacob actually would be the third one as well. I don't know. It's hard to like rank those. They're all people who have got a lot of criticism from even having them on. And then in terms of who I think is the most controversial, well, to be honest, for me, it probably is Morley Robbins. Controversial because his opinions were definitely outside of the range of what generally not just what my guests think, but are, further away from me. But, I went into it with an open mind. I went into it for a specific reason, which I'm happy to discuss as we get to those questions about him. It was an interesting experience. I'm glad I did it.
Wonderful. Right. Okay. Well, let's get into the first question, which is it true that there's no such thing as a good stressor?
This is Jay Feldman. And I'd say it didn't get a lot of pushback in the comments, but I think in a way this is one of the most controversial takes because it really upends, well, I suppose all of the takes do to some degree, but I would say to a very significant degree it upends the current understanding of not just like human nutritional needs or whatever, but like like organic physiology for biological organisms. It's really baked into like biochemistry these days that the concept of hormesis, so meaning that there is such a thing as good stress, that a certain amount of stress it's beneficial to the organism so long as it's not prolonged, so long as it's not too extreme, and that the organism actually benefits from that. It's a central idea in physiology, especially human physiology. And so his perspective that was really introduced to justify or to minimize the detrimental effect of toxic exposure. Because as we've talked about, one of my favorite episodes, which I think doesn't get probably enough credit, is 104, which is where we talk about the real root cause of the chronic health disease. I think it's 104, and we talk about the different extreme perspectives. And I give an example of an extreme Beauchampian perspective, an extreme Pasteurian perspective, and this is the perspective of infection causes disease versus an excess of toxicity building up in the terrain causes a disease. And the guests we've had on tend to be more terrain theory people. Some of them are extreme terrain theory people. You could argue most, actually, like in the sense that they just believe if you get enough of the good stuff, nutrients in and the toxins out, then everything will be fine. So that's quite common, actually, among most of the guests. And so, but of course, the mainstream is the opposite. It's Pasteurian. It's like it believes that disease is caused by organisms and that the toxic exposure, no big deal. The liver and kidneys handle it just fine. A lot of them believe that detoxification isn't even a real thing, all of that kind of stuff. So his perspective, as I understood it, was that they are justifying that perspective by saying, hey, a little bit of stress on the organism, a little bit of toxin, a little bit of whatever, that's good for you, no problem. And that's an interesting perspective. And honestly, if I were to give my take on that, now, obviously, there are things that are considered hormetic stressors, like exercise or heat exposure, like a sauna, which are undoubtedly beneficial so long as you don't overdo them. Undoubtedly, at a certain level for everyone, even someone who's very unfit. I mean, I've said, you shouldn't go from never getting off the couch to going to the gym and running for an hour. That's not a good idea in the vast majority of cases. However, going from never getting off the couch to walking, a few minutes every couple of hours, as we talked about recently in the exercise episode, very beneficial. So even though that's a stress to the body, and so I'd say probably the danger thing of that perspective and what I've seen with people, not so much in the health world, but certainly in terms of the psychology, is people are like, oh, stress is making me unhealthy, and therefore I'm going to avoid all stress. What does that include? I'm not going to do anything challenging. I'm not going to put myself out there. I'm not going to push myself outside my comfort zone, all that kind of stuff. And that is very detrimental over time not necessarily because stress is beneficial at all, but because having novel experiences, challenging yourself, achieving things is good for you. So that's more the challenge. And so with exercise and heat as two examples in the health world, his perspective is, I'm not saying exercise is bad for you, even though it is stressful. What I'm saying is that it's the other aspects of exercise that are good for you, not the stress aspect. So yes, even if you're pretty healthy, if you start, running intensely, let's say doing high intensity interval training, or even lifting intense weights, that there's definitely going to be a temporary spike in stress chemicals. And his perspective, as I understood it, is there's nothing beneficial about that temporary rise in stress chemicals. However, there is something beneficial about the action of doing whatever it is, whether it's running, saunaing, lifting weights, or whatever. There's other reasons that it's beneficial other than the stress. And although I haven't 100%, fallen on the side with this, I would say I'm broadly in agreement with him. That's my. It's ironic because my hormonal body composition brand is called Hormetics, and that's because it stands for a combination of hormones, metabolism, and genetics. It's the three fundamental pillars of understanding. Go to hormetics.health if you don't know what I'm talking about. But hormetics is also the study of hormesis, which is a little bit confusing. And by the time we already went for it, it was a bit too late. No one seems to really use it. That was the conclusion. So we're sticking with it. But yeah, do I actually believe in the science of hormetics? Probably actually not. Now again, it doesn't mean you shouldn't do things that stress your body. I gave the examples of exercise, sauna, cold exposure could be that category. Doing breathing practices could be in that category. There's a bunch of different things, all of which I'm often a fan of, depending on the person's situation, which are stressful. And I do not encourage you to go around avoiding all stress at all costs. It will make your life smaller and smaller, and it will make yourself smaller and smaller over time. So I'm not recommending that. But just understand the benefit is from things other than stress. Like if it's stressful for you to leave the house, then the benefit of leaving the house anyway is not the fact it's stressing you. The benefit of leaving the house is the sunshine and the fresh air and the meeting new people and all the rest of it. Or let's say you're a bit beyond that, but let's say it's stressful for you doing public speaking. It's one of people's most common fears, right? The benefit is not getting up on stage and being flooded with stress chemicals, but the benefit is that you're going to feel more confident in the future speaking to people in general, that you might actually have something to say and that people might listen and you might actually help them, or all of that kind of stuff, right? So I'm broadly basically agree. I would say that stress is something that sometimes is an inevitable part of doing things that are a good idea, but it's not the stress itself that's really beneficial.
That makes sense. I mean, as well, if you try to avoid all stresses, that's going to be stressful in and of itself anyway.
That is true, yes.
Yeah. No, but I like the distinction too of what you're making is it's not necessarily the raising of the stress chemicals that's beneficial, but you are going to gain benefit by lifting weights because you're building muscle and everything else. So that it's the clarification of it.
Yeah, and probably, right? Like lifting weights actually just damages muscle. Usually it grows back, but there are specific circumstances, like looking at the moment into a disease fairly rare called HPP, where the body basically isn't able to utilize phosphate, and it's really going to struggle with that process, for instance. So in that case, it's not necessarily such a good idea, and that's a pretty rare genetic condition. But the point is that there's always exceptions, there's always caveats. Sometimes even I speak in these definitive ways just for the ease of speaking, but we should always remember that there are exceptions. Now, I spent a long time explaining that one. I hopefully won't do that with most of them because they're a bit more, easy to understand, but I wanted to do that on justice. And honestly, really all I did is explain the perspective as Jay said it, so I want to give him credit there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And again, for all of these, I will make sure I put the links to the episodes that we are discussing down in the description below. So check out the description because it's got all the links if you're interested. The other thing, when you said episode 104, it was episode 105 for the real cause. So
Thank you.
You were close. Yeah.
Thank you.
So our next question, we're moving on to Grant's episode. So is vitamin A a toxin?
Yeah. This one's a tricky one. So my perspective from my experience is whenever I've tested retinol, which is the type of vitamin A you can test, it has always been high. So I've always felt completely safe in saying, I'm going to avoid vitamin A supplements. I'm going to avoid, vitamin A in foods unless I really think there's other benefits. Like for me, that's only dairy. It's the only it's the only significant vitamin A consuming food that I have. So that's an easier one for me. I don't have to worry about becoming deficient in vitamin A. So I realized that one, I've never had to kind of grapple with that. But hypothetically, how would I feel about that if my vitamin A was not above the reference range? What if it was below the reference range? What if it was a lot below the reference range? Obviously, that's where it's getting trickier. What I will say is, and people have frequently suggested debate on this subject. I think it's the most common debate I'm requested to do. I'd love to start doing debate episodes. Honestly, guys, if you want to see debate episodes, help me grow the channel. Unfortunately, people don't want to do them. No one wants their ideas challenged generally, and they're only willing to do them if it exposes them to a larger audience. So you have to help me have a larger audience, and then I'll probably find people willing to do it. That's how it works. But even the biggest podcasts in the world, often, when the debates are suggested, at least one side is unwilling to do it. But anyway, so what I will say though is, I haven't actually had many people on who are big vitamin A proponents, but I did recently, Morley, and I didn't bring him on to debate with him whether vitamin A is a good, nutrient or not, and whether people should have more of it. And I think he thought I was at one point, and he started kind of explaining why it was a good idea. And I said, no, I'm not. I never bring people on to argue with them, or I guess with Grant Genereux, with the second time I had him on, I said we'll have a little bit of a debate format. But certainly, if I don't know someone well, I'm not going to debate them, let alone argue.
Yeah, you're definitely coming as well from a more inquisitive nature and asking questions to understand it, to get the science to move forward with it. You've never, yeah. I think people can also feel safe with you when you're in discussion with them.
Yeah, if I have them on, it's because I honestly want to understand their perspective. I'm genuinely curious, absolutely, and that's why we don't have more guests on, because I'm not more curious. Or I guess if I am, as I just said before, unfortunately, it's not easy to get guests on unless the podcast is bigger. So again, please help me grow it. But but the one thing I did posit to him is, look, I'm not here to debate it. I was just trying to say, from your perspective of vitamin A being so important and essential, how is it that Grant Genereux has got to a point of, for years now, having retinol levels not just at the bottom of the reference range, but at almost undetectable levels, and having better health than he did before? Now, I have to phrase it that way. I realize he's not maybe in a position of perfect health. A lot of health teachers are not. Because usually they get into it because they have their problems. And that was Grant. And he really got into it because he had, serious issues. He had serious skin issues and he had chronic kidney disease. And he was not that far away from not being with us anymore. And he reversed that with his approach. And that, to me, deserves respect, no matter what else you believe and what you think. And so, and then, another common criticism of Grant's approach is, well, he went on such a restrictive regime, not even just diet. He was on a restrictive diet, but, no supplements, no medications. There's a huge amount of things he cut out. And so who's to say that it wasn't something else that he cut out that led to his, rapid recovery and progress? Well, I don't know about rapid. I think rapid, certainly by medical standards, where they would have said that it's very difficult to recover from CKD. And I'd say it's a fair point again, and because he didn't do extensive testing early on, it's hard to say for sure. But it really is irrelevant to my point. It's the same one that I posited to Morley, and I'll posit to anyone who would like me to, who is a vitamin A defender. How is it possible that Grant Genereux could have almost undetectable levels of retinol in his blood for a long time now and be, if nothing else, at least a lot healthier than he was? Like, how is that possible? And no one has an answer for me for that. I mean, I kind of came up with one myself with the episode of Morley. I was like, maybe the body is so good at storing vitamin A, and he wasn't young when he started the whole process. Maybe he still has a bunch of vitamin A in tissues. And Morley actually thought, I believe he responded saying, yeah, that's a good point. That may well explain it. But, I thought about it since, and I'm like, well, if that does explain it, if vitamin A is essential and the only reason Grant feels great is because he has so much vitamin A in his tissues, even though he's basically had zero intake for 10 years and zero detectable in his blood, it still kind of disproves this idea that we need to be having vitamin A on an ongoing basis, doesn't it? So I realized Grant is only one person. Of course, other people like Dr. Smith and a bunch of others in that community now also claim to have been doing it for many years and, to have very low levels, if maybe not as low as Grant's. And they all say that they're doing better. Out of those people saying it, of course, I realized that other people saying that they didn't feel good doing that protocol. But generally, either Grant's protocol or Dr. Smith's protocol, they're different protocols. But generally, I would say there are not many people who've done it for a long time who have very low levels and say, that it had a bad response. It's more that they did the protocol and it had a bad response. Like they didn't do well with it for whatever reason. It's not so much I got to the point of really low levels of retinol and I realized it was, and I developed this condition and then, it was solved by having it. It's like, I don't see that anyway. So I guess that's a big preamble. What's my bottom line in it all? I would say that you have to treat having low levels of vitamin A as an experiment. And if you want to do it at all. If you don't want to do it at all, my recommendation would keep it near the bottom. When I say near the bottom, the bottom quartile, third, maybe even half of the reference range. Why? Because that's already been determined to be safe and not excessive. So that would be, to me, the moderate position. The experimental research position would be to go lower than that and see how you do. And if you do great, then I would not argue with the results you're getting. But if you do not do great, then I would consider if adding vitamin A in, probably especially in food form, would make you feel better. If you've ever thought to yourself, why am I always hungry? Why am I always thinking about food? And then beating yourself up about it, stop. It's not lack of discipline. I know this is controversial to say, but the truth is it actually isn't your fault. You're not greedy or gluttonous. You're not undisciplined. You're actually leptin resistant, and you're not alone. Leptin resistance is a consequence of living a modern lifestyle of excess blue light, excess stress, not enough sleep, and chemical food additives. It's the number one reason so many people in their 40s and 50s feel hungry 24/7 and can't shift the weight no matter what they try. Hi, I'm Morley Robbins from the Rejuvenate podcast, and along with Dr. Miriam Mikitsky, I built the Hormetics weight optimization system because we kept seeing the same thing. Good people doing everything right, but still stuck because their hormones were actually the problem. And conversely, when we helped them with their hormones, losing weight, not overeating became really easy for them without even trying. The leptin balance formula is the first formula we released. It contains African mango, chromium picolinate, Ceylon cinnamon, and alpha-lipoic acid. Chosen because the science shows that these ingredients at these precise quantities help restore the full satiated signal naturally. Go to advancedhealthgenetics.com/leptin, order now, and you will be invited to join our clinical study the moment you check out at no extra cost. So you can track exactly how well it works for you. And you can help us to prove to the world exactly how well it works. And to thank you for being a podcast listener, use code REJUVENATE at checkout for 20% off now. That's advancedhealthgenetics.com/leptin and use REJUVENATE for 20% off now.
Yeah, I mean, because the next question here is it a good idea to take vitamin A? So I think you were kind of, touching on that subject. So is there somebody that is a good idea that they should be taking vitamin A?
Like as a supplement, yeah. I suppose in a hypothetical case, which I haven't actually heard of, where someone follows this approach, is very determined, despite symptoms, gets less and less and less healthy, more and more and more symptoms, and then shows up at a practitioner, gets a blood test, gets diagnosed with low levels of vitamin A, and then gets told your symptoms are caused by low vitamin A, we need to get it up urgently, then taking vitamin A supplementation would make sense. If it's just a bit low, but you don't really know, I personally would still be cautious. Anything that your body tends to, let's say, accumulate, even if it's not a toxin, there is no doubt with vitamin A, as with many things, as with copper, as with iron, as with zinc, as with vitamin D, as with vitamin E, etc., there is a level that your body has too much of it. And vitamin A toxicity, as in when there actually is too much, is probably the most studied nutritional toxicity of all. There's at least hundreds of studies of what happens when it gets too high. So the possibility of it getting too high is very real, even if obviously the advocates of vitamin A claim that it's massively overblown. It's still definitely a real possibility. And so to reduce the possibility of that happening to you, I would, and the food sources are often, nice. It's not like it's difficult to get enough vitamin A from food, whether it be, dairy or carrots, sweet potato. Who doesn't like those kind of foods? Like, generally, there'll be something pretty high, is my point, in vitamin A that is easy enough to consume. Like, it's not a hardship. So that would be my general take on it, except for in this specific condition, of course, of a practitioner diagnosing you as low in it and diagnosing that it's caused by low vitamin A. Then you may just have to supplement.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense of looking at it like that. And you said, and as in the previous episodes that we've done, there we go over how to test for it and all of that stuff. So again, have a look at those. Unless there's anything else you want to add here before we move on to the next question.
No, that's good.
Okay. Yeah. Perfect. So the next question we're moving on. Our next guest was Dr. Garrett Smith. Yeah. This one I was, is vitamin D3 rat poison? When I saw him that, his comment on that, I was like, really? Okay. I hadn't, that's the first time I'd ever come across it like that. So I'd love to hear your opinion.
This is a funny one because an experience of crossing worlds, as people may possibly know, I am the formulator for a bunch of different brands that are completely unconnected to each other. And, that I don't ever advertise in this podcast, for instance. And I had a support query come from one of those brands come to me and they're like, Elwin, do you know what this person's talking about? And I said, funnily enough, yes. It was someone saying, do you use cholecalciferol, which is rat poison, or do you use the good vitamin D3? And I said, okay, this person's confused, but I know where they've got it from. So let's clarify. It is true that the vitamin D that you get from the sun is chemically identical at a certain stage. It goes through different stages as that is in supplements. However, it is also true that it is arguably more of a hormone than a vitamin, and that consuming a large amount of a hormone kind of willy-nilly without any thought going into it is always a bit of a risky endeavor. Whether you're, they kind of say, vitamin D3 is like a hormone to kind of big it up, but it's also, it's like, do you just want to be taking testosterone without thinking about it? Or do you want to be taking progesterone without thinking about it? Or do you want to be taking estrogen without thinking about it, etc.? Like DHEA, any of them, like cortisol, they all can be helpful in certain cases, but they're all things that you don't necessarily just want to take, even if it is biochemically identical to what your body will make itself. You with me so far? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I do. It does make sense.
So then, right, the rat poison thing. All right, so let's clear up this controversy. Is it true that calciferol, I don't know if I'm saying it correctly, I think so, the exact same thing that your body makes from sun, the exact same thing that you find in vitamin D supplements, is it also sold as a rat poison? And the answer is yes. So that's not made up, that's not hyperbole. What is kind of hyperbole, though, is to describe the amount of vitamin D3 that is found in supplements as a poison, as a rat poison. Here's why. Look this up for me, Chrissy, while I talk, and then tell me how much potassium is used when they give a lethal injection to kill someone convicted of capital punishment. So vitamin D3, and when it is used as a rat poison, it is. You can look this one up as well for me, please, Chrissy. I didn't look it up beforehand. When it's used as a rat poison, it's at least 10,000 times the amount that is used in a, let's say, usual supplement dosage. So the criticism of a vitamin D3 supplement, the fundamental criticism that Dr. Smith made and that anyone would make, other than that it's messing with hormonal regulation, I guess, by supplementing it. But the more important problem is that it increases the absorption of calcium in the digestive tract, and it increases the amount of calcium being poured into tissues. And so over time, that is a big problem. That's called calcification. And there is a theory, it's a theory of aging that basically says, like, aging is calcification. The more you calcify, the more you become stiff, the more you become rigid, the more you become dried out, and the more that you age. And if we think about it, being stiff, being dried out, and being rigid are classic signs of aging. Then there's also the specifics. So if you pull too much calcium into the kidneys, which I realize can happen for many reasons, but that can be kidney stones. If you pull too many into the gallbladder, that's called gallstones, and etc. So it is true that especially an excess of calcium being pulled into the tissues is seriously bad news. All right, give me those stats, Chrissy.
Right. So what it says here is, so for the D3, it contains up to 900 times more than the supplement.
Okay.
900 times more vitamin D3 than an average daily vitamin D3 supplement.
Right, but the reason I said 10,000 is because that's for a rat versus a human. So if we think about the amount that is safe for a rat to have, it's going to be significantly less than the amount that is safe for a human to have. Does that make sense? Because they are like less than 100th our weight. If I'm 80 kilos, I think a rat that weighs 800 grams is a very big rat. So it's so it scales by that as well. So I think that's where I got maybe it's almost 100,000 times then, if we take that into account. Yeah, okay. I had between 10 and 100 in my head. Okay. So yeah, it's a massively higher amount basically that is given to a rat than the equivalent amount that is given to a human based on body weight, which is usually how we would figure those things out. And all right, so let me just, before you say the potassium number, the recommended daily amount of potassium for a human being that they actually need to be optimally healthy, again, I didn't research, but off the top of my head, it's about 4 or 5 grams. They say it's the one that people are most deficient in, not because they're that frequently doing tissue tests, but because when they actually look at people's diet, something like, sometimes they say 99, 98% of people are not meeting their potassium targets. And they're often having more sodium than they need, although not always, especially in the health world. So basically, most people are not having enough potassium, and we're talking about something like 4 or 5 grams. So how much is used for a lethal injection to actually stop someone's heart and kill them, Chrissy?
So yeah, it says between 9 and 18 grams.
So that's how much they use in a lethal injection. Now, before the people scream at me, but that's different, that's an IV, that's not the same as having it, consumed orally. You're right. So the actual lethal amount for potassium chloride is considered to be about 2.5 grams per kilo. So for instance, for someone my size, 80 kilos, that's about 200 grams. So 200 grams, the recommended amount, 4 or 5 grams, let's say 5 for simplicity. So 40 or 50 times my recommended amount of potassium that I need to make sure I actually hit will kill me. So the idea that vitamin D3 is rat poison, because if I have a 10 to 100,000 times as much dose, that is a lethal dose. It's clever branding. It's obviously caught on, but to me, it's kind of silly for the reason that I just said. If I'm going to call vitamin D3 rat poison, I may as well call potassium lethal injection. Like it's the same principle. And in fact, the calling potassium lethal injection is way more justified than calling vitamin D3 rat poison, because you need way less of a incrementally high dose to reach that level where it is actually lethal.
Yeah, I like that you've put that as an analogy together, because that is the thing. When you see a headline like that, you take pause and then you question, well, actually, should I be taking this?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's what. And this person was like misunderstood, obviously, and they were saying, and I'm not blaming Dr. Smith on this. I have no idea where they heard it, but they were saying that do you have the good D3 or do you have the rat poison kind? I had to explain. There's no difference, and then I had to explain this whole thing. So at least I've got this now. We can turn it into a clip, and I can direct people to it next time they ask this question. But now, does that mean that vitamin D3 is fine to take? No, which is why I started with that first, rather than the kind of debunking of the branding. It is problematic. That is true. However, I will also say, just like I said about the vitamin A, but actually I mean this one. That was more theoretical, that previous answer about if you ever get to a point where it's really low and you're suffering with symptoms, take it. I've never actually heard of that. What I absolutely have heard of, and I know people well who've been in this position, where they have really low levels of D3 and they're suffering. And the most common thing is that they keep getting infections, like life-threatening infections, fluid building up in the lungs infections, for instance, with one of my best friends. And he had really low D3 levels. They pumped him full of, ridiculously high levels of rat poisoning, and he felt great again, and he was able to function and carry on working and not be in the ICU and feed his family and all the rest of it. Now, I know the pure terrain theory people say, you're just suppressing the symptoms, blah, 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 blah. Okay, maybe that's true, but in this case, not suppressing the system may well have led to his death. So the idea that it's always a bad idea to suppress the symptoms, again, to me, doesn't bear out in practice. So I guess if I'd limited that to a one-word answer, the correct answer to that would have been yes. But if I expand it a little bit more, now, having said that, do I think it's always a good idea to routinely take it? Maybe at very low doses, like those other companies that I've talked about, if we include D3, because, generally it's something that's desired, and the studies show that it supports, I tend to always use a minimal amount. Like it's close to the RDA, which is, from the D3 proponent's position, woefully inefficient, like not nearly enough, insufficient, sorry, not nearly enough. But I'm satisfied with that because it's never going to build up to a toxic amount. It's when people start using, like some, prominent health experts recommend, like 5,000-10,000 plus IUs a day, where then suddenly you're getting into that area where you may well build up a level that's too much. And we have to also acknowledge that different people are very different. Some people can take 5,000 IUs a day and their vitamin D3 levels, the calciferol, will still be below the reference range, even after months of doing it. I know someone like that. And so that person, it's probably less dangerous for them to be doing that. For someone else, I know they did the same amount, and they got to excessive levels that even their GP, medical doctor, told them that was too much and they needed to stop taking it. So there is that wide range as well. And so if you are going to take it, and anything other than a really, really low dose on a regular basis, it definitely is worth frequently, periodically testing to make sure you're not overdoing it.
Okay. Yeah, because one of the things as well, I know we're moving around with the different guests, like one of the parts of the root cause protocol that Morley Robbins says is to stop taking D3 as well.
He also does, yeah. That's the thing, like everyone has their own perspective, and a lot of it is about these controversial nutrients, right? Like some of them are, most of them are anti-iron, some of them are pro-zinc, some of them are not, some of them are pro-copper, some of them are not, some of them are pro-A or D3, some of them are not. I think those 5 I just said. Some of them pro-calcium, some of them not. I think Dr. Smith switched on that, for instance, when he was a guest on here. Both times he was still anti-calcium. I think he switched to being pro-calcium since. So, I'd say probably those 6 I just mentioned are the most debated nutrients, certainly among our guests. Vitamin B6, I guess you could maybe put in that category as well of being controversial. Some people saying it's dangerous, some people saying it's very beneficial. Maybe vitamin C, you could broaden it to 8. But yeah, I'd say probably the copper, iron, vitamin A, D3 the top 4 of people debating and disagreeing. One thing I will say, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to go back, I don't think we have any other questions about vitamin A. Before we leave vitamin A, one thing I will say, what does annoy me in the comments about vitamin A is when people just spew the mainstream position as if that is like some kind of revelation. And it's like, we know what the mainstream position is. I'd hope that we do. And so I wonder why they do it. And it's, and I see this everywhere, of course, outside my own little world of my content, but I don't see where people take joy, it seems, or they put some effort into it, so they must feel energized in some way of defending the mainstream position. Even if the mainstream position is right, that's fine. It doesn't need you to defend it. It's already got every institution, every doctor pretty much, the whole system is already defending and upholding that position. It really doesn't need you to join in my or anyone else's comment section. If you're going to vociferously, I see people vociferously defend stuff that I disagree with in the comment section, but it's stuff that's, for instance, hair mineral analysis being the be all and end all of testing. Now, I don't agree with that or believe that personally. It's not on this list today because we've never actually had a guest say it. But I'm happy for them to, defend it as hard as they want, because at least, not who else is defending that position, right? Like, it's fair. But why, push so hard to defend the pro vitamin A or the even the pro D3 position, even though I kind of agree with it, as I said. It's if you're going to fight for something, fight for something that is not already what everyone in the mainstream believes, would be my suggestion.
Good suggestion. Right, we're going to move on to the next question now, which is it a good idea to take copper?
I didn't remember that was next, but that is a good one, I guess, because to be fair to that's one of the things that's being fought in my comment section as well, way before we had Morley on. It's not a mainstream position that copper is really great and essential and, you should take more of it. That is a little bit fringe. So I've always felt fair enough about the people who are really fighting for and defending that position. Is it a good idea to take copper? Well, let's break it down first. Is it a good idea to avoid high copper foods? I would say I see a lot of that, again, in kind of either my community or the communities that are kind of adjacent to mine. And there's a lot made out of, I had this thing with copper in, and suddenly I had, all these symptoms show up, and they always seem convinced it's the copper. I'm not so convinced, personally. as Morley pointed out, like a lot of things don't actually have that much copper in. I don't completely agree with him that everything these days is severely depleted in copper, or almost everything. I think seafood, for instance, it still has a very significant amount of copper. Chocolate would be another example, something that has a significant amount of copper. And there are certain things, like chocolate comes from trees, where wheat may well have less copper than it did 50 or 100 years ago because of modern agricultural methods. I can completely believe that. But chocolate cultivation isn't really like that, and I wouldn't expect a massive reduction in copper levels in chocolate, for instance, because of modern agricultural methods, because it doesn't really apply. Same with some of the nuts, which often tend to be high copper, like Brazil nuts, for instance. They grow on trees, and they're impossible to grow anywhere other than Brazil, which is where they get a name from it. So these have not had copper levels destroyed by modern agricultural methods. So there are exceptions, but I think generally, in certain corners of the internet, it's overblown how copper in foods is causing all these symptoms in people. However, so I'm not, except for maybe the very highest copper things. If you have provably tested, when I say tested, I don't mean hormonal analysis, because that only is showing what your body's excreting. And even more crazily to me, there's like all these other rules of if your body's excreting a low amount of copper, that means that you're copper toxic. Well, that's convenient. So if it's excreting a lot, you're copper toxic. If it's excreting low amounts. Now, to be fair, I understand that in Wilson's disease, which is a medically high level of copper toxicity, that often the person is excreting a low amount in the hair. So I'm not saying it's not based on anything, but what I'm pointing out is the people who are anti-copper, there seems to be no kind of reading on an HMA that will convince them that the person is not high in copper, that the person is just actually low in copper. So I personally like to do a blood test for this, and testing copper and ceruloplasmin to get a more accurate take on this. But anyway, so eating high copper foods, I would prefer to just increase the level of zinc rather than avoiding high copper foods, either with high zinc foods or with supplementation. Increase the level of molybdenum, either with high molybdenum foods or with supplementation, as opposed to avoiding high copper foods. Probably the extreme end of that would be like liver, because beef liver is probably the highest copper food. I think we've got a question on that coming up. In fact, I think it was next on the list, so I'll cover those together now. But I think there's other reasons to avoid liver. The animal liver, beef liver, whatever. Liver tends to be high in copper because it just accumulates a lot of stuff. It also accumulates way more lead than beef muscle. It accumulates way more cadmium than beef muscle. It accumulates way more in most toxins than beef, than the muscle, 10 to 100 times as much in most cases. So I'd say those are more the reasons to avoid liver. But it is a very high dose of copper, so maybe you could argue with that. But there's a lot of people who think that grains and beans and all these kind of foods are making them sick because there's so much copper, and I personally don't see it. And if it's true, you could just balance that out by taking more zinc, which will increase your production of metallothionein, which will help your body detoxify that copper. And then there's the argument, maybe you don't need to detoxify the copper, you actually need to increase the ceruloplasmin so the copper becomes bioavailable to your body, as opposed to just excreting it. But anyway, so I wouldn't avoid high copper foods. Taking copper supplements is more dubious to me. The quote unquote good kind, if you are going to take it, would be like a bisglycinate, the amino acid chelated type. And I'd really put that in the same category as vitamin D3 or vitamin A, which is I would only take it if you know you need it, based on testing and probably practitioner involvement. And the reason being that just like vitamin A or just like vitamin D3, there is such a thing as too much. Now, obviously from a Morley Robbins, and he's not the only one, kind of school of thought, we're very far away from too much. But the crucial distinction to me is if you already have too much free copper, which a lot of people who are unhealthy do, the reason for that is because you don't have enough ceruloplasmin. And if you don't have enough ceruloplasmin, Should you be adding more copper into the mix? So, some would say yes. I would say, well, if your body's already struggling to make enough of the thing which makes copper useful rather than damaging, because that's what ceruloplasmin does, should you add in more copper without knowing for sure if your body's going to make more ceruloplasmin to keep up with that extra copper? Does that make sense, Chrissy? Am I getting a bit?
Yeah, no, that does make sense. Yeah, because it's how do you say? It's a roll of the dice. You have no idea by
You have no
doing
idea
that.
unless you test, and
Yes.
I encourage people to test. If it's certainly, I guess that comes back to just like I said with D3. If you are going to supplement copper, frequently test your copper and your ceruloplasmin. And then if your copper, basically, if you take more copper, and then I wouldn't leave it too long, a week, a month, something like that, not 6 months. And then if your level of free copper actually goes down, then great. That means your level of bioavailable copper has gone up, which is good. But don't just do it because someone told you to, and don't not measure that, and not seeing if you're actually just making the problem worse and worse would be my perspective. If you've been thinking to yourself recently, not even eating that much, why am I still gaining weight? This message is for you. Hi, I'm Morley Robbins. Most people don't realize insulin resistance is quietly turning more and more of what you eat into stored fat, even when portions are small. That's why Dr. Miriam McKidsky and I created the Hormetics Weight Optimization System, and our most popular formula is the Insulin Balance Formula. It contains precisely chosen quantities of berberine, fenugreek, zinc, and folate, proven in studies to help your cells hear insulin again so your body burns those calories instead of storing them as fat. Go to advancedhealthgenetics.com/insulin, order now, and you'll be invited to join our clinical study the moment you check out at no extra cost, so you can track exactly how much better you feel. Use code REJUVENATE for 20% off now. Go to advancedhealthgenetics.com/insulin and remember to use the code REJUVENATE for 20% off now.
Yeah. Again, it's like all these things of yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. It's still so confusing sometimes.
Well, let me boil it down then before we go to the next thing.
Yeah.
You have to test it. That is the through line of all this. Should you take vitamin A? Test. Should you take vitamin D3? Test. Should you take copper? Test. That's really the through line of what I'm saying, and I'm giving the details of it. Vitamin A test retinol, and here's the level you should be happy with, and here's the level you should worry about, and etc. I'm going into more details, but I think the fundamental thing that almost everyone misses and doesn't do is this thing about testing. And I would say the one thing that was a little bit disappointing to me about I really enjoyed the second episode of Morley where we went through my test results, but that he wasn't willing to say that even with someone who obviously had too high levels of vitamin A, and even with someone who obviously had too low levels of zinc, he still didn't want to go against his general recommendations. That's disappointing to me. And, I'm picking on him a little bit. I don't know if every other guest would have been the same. Like if I had gone to Grant and said, here's my test results, look at my vitamin A is extremely low, he probably also would have said, good, don't take it. I don't know, but so I guess I'm picking on him a little bit because he was kind enough and, generous enough of his time to willing to come back and go through my results with him. So I realized that, and sorry for that. But it is generally just, a shame to me when people don't adjust their recommendations based on the facts staring them in the face. And he made good points, like we need to find out why your vitamin A is so high, and it could be liver damage, it could be this, and I get all that. But still, in that specific circumstance where someone definitely doesn't obviously need more right now, why would you still recommend that they have more? And I think probably, if I had to guess, it's because he didn't want to be caught on video recommending, let's say, taking zinc supplements when
Yes,
that would
yeah.
like he didn't want that to be clipped and go on his forums. And Morley's recommending zinc. He's going against everything he's ever said, all the rest of it. So I don't know if that's what was going on. That's my guess, because I do believe that he sincerely wants to help people. But I think it's a shame when all of these people, again, I'm only picking him because he's kind enough to come on and do that episode with me, but generally most of these people, all of them, are unwilling to bend their recommendations even in the face of significant evidence that it may be a good idea. And we could argue, look, am I being a hypocrite here because I talked about Grant's A being so low? I said he got better and better. And you could maybe defend Morley and you say, well, when you said at the time you were feeling better, which is true. And so if you've got like really high A and you're feeling better and better, maybe that's a good thing. Well, maybe it is. But I still don't know, when all the evidence points to the fact that you can get to a toxic level of vitamin A, why you would not say to someone, okay, you probably shouldn't take it, even if most people should, just for now, until you've got that level down again. That doesn't make much sense to me. And so, this is the number one problem. Like, even people who, pay for consultations with me, I'm surprised how often they will be like, I don't want to test things. I just want your opinion. And I'm like, my opinion is you need to test. Like, the idea of doing something because of some dogma or some authority telling you to, it's so 20th century, it's so out of date now. Like, what it really is BC. It's it's like a religious idea. I need to take it because I believe in it. And it's like, I'm not saying testing is perfect. Sometimes it's inaccurate and unhelpful, and I realize it's not always the be all and end all, but it is a starting place that we really don't want to skip with these kind of things. Now, sure, with vitamin B12, is it fine to take a big dose? Yeah. Is it even fine to take a big dose every day? Or probably, even when you get B12 on a test and it's way above the reference range, the doctor will say, have you been supplementing B12? And you go, yeah. And they go, oh, okay. It's nothing to worry about. So it's not like it's always a thing that you have to test. But of all the things we're talking about today, the A, the D, the copper, I think everything else we're about to get to, you got to test. Test, don't guess.
Yeah. That is a big key component for the takeaway for today, for sure. For sure. Right. So our next question we are coming to, is it a good idea to take supplemental zinc?
Yeah. Let's address that. So I guess it's, I've given the game away already with that with my previous answer. In some circumstances, yes. And, we've got to remember a reference range. Morley thought, rightly or wrongly, maybe rightly, that the reference range for copper was too low and that people should actually have maybe the higher end, I believe, unless I've misremembered that. But it's definitely true for zinc in men. We've got to remember reference ranges are averages, not optimal. So a lot of men are low in zinc, especially these days, for various reasons that we won't go into because I've covered it before. So if you're low end of a reference range, as I was when I shared my test results, it's absolutely a good idea. Now, Morley's point, which I also agree with, is you also have to find out why it's low in the first place or why it's high in the first place. And that's absolutely true as well. You want to look into the root cause, but still, if you need it, you need it. As I said, I don't think copper is that hard to get from food, as long as you're willing to eat certain foods. It is pretty hard to get even the recommended daily amount from foods. Especially if you're vegetarian, it's almost impossible, especially for men, unless, of course, you supplement. But even if you don't, Morley made the point that the high levels of copper that, as I said, one part of my audience is always worried about, it may be completely inaccurate because a lot of those nutritional food tables were made decades and decades ago, and the soil's been significantly depleted since. Well, the same thing's true for zinc. Like the soil's not only been depleted of copper, the soil's been depleted of zinc and molybdenum and all kinds of micronutrients, everything basically except for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, like we talked about before. So it's very likely that you're not getting enough zinc to be optimal. Your body burns through zinc when your immune system is under challenge, which a lot of people's are. Your body burns through zinc when you're stressed. The body burns through zinc when you have toxic exposure, especially heavy metals, because it uses zinc to make this heavy metal detoxing chelating agent, or actually many of them, but well-known one called metallothionein. So is it a good idea to supplement zinc? I'd say in many cases, yes. Yes, it is. Is it a good idea to test to make sure you're not overdoing it? Yes, it's still the same thing, despite everything. I kind of framed this one very differently from some of the other ones, like as if I'm just going to say, yes, it's a good idea. But you can overdo it. You can overdo it. Now, we haven't talked about Jacob yet. I think he's coming up. But, Jacob's theory is your cells or your tissues are starving for it, but it's just not getting to them, which, again, may be true. But if it's building up in your blood, then why would you take more of it, like in a supplement form? It still doesn't make sense. You've got to resolve that issue first before you continue supplementing it. So, again, it's worth testing. And, I live not really in a city, but in the outskirts of a city now. I used to live in the middle of nowhere. I prefer to live in the middle of nowhere, but it is what it is. And, there are some benefits, and I have to admit, one of them is I can just frequently go to the lab, just test my zinc and my copper and my ceruloplasmin is like, and less commonly, but also my vitamin D3 and my vitamin A, and just and see how it's doing. It's such a good idea to not be guessing when it comes to this kind of stuff. Now, I'm overdoing it compared to most people because I'm in a more volatile situation because my body's still and it seems to have accelerated its effort significantly at excreting lead, this heavy metal that I had very large amounts of. So, if you're in an average situation where your body hasn't got such a toxic buildup, you definitely don't need to do it as often as me. But it is still worth doing every now and then, every 6 months, every year, something like that, testing the levels of all these nutrients that we've talked about today and we'll talk about, and making sure that they're not significantly too high or significantly too low, because both of them can be very problematic. And yeah, zinc is definitely in that category.
Yeah. I mean, I know for me, going back to the NutriVal, yeah, that was definitely one that I needed to supplement with. It's testing. And like you say, there's all these different mechanisms, of action maybe, but like the relationships, the synergy that these have. There's that push-pull relationship. There's a lot going on. So you do want to know where your levels are at so that you can know what might be affecting what.
Absolutely. One of my biggest regrets as a practitioner is not getting this perspective earlier, like just recommending stuff to people. You might even be one of them, Chrissy, a while ago, and just recommending it based on anything other than knowing for sure, which is what testing provides you. I guess you never know for sure, but you're just guessing. And I realized the idea, an experienced practitioner could just tell based on symptoms and all the rest of it. Not in my experience. I've had so many people come to me who've seen so many experienced practitioners, often, very expensive practitioners, even famous practitioners, et cetera, et cetera. I do the executive coaching. So people who are very wealthy, they spend a lot of money on their health, before me, often 6 figures, sometimes even more than that, with all these people. And then I, sometimes it takes me longer than other times, but, I'll quickly get to a level where there's this major thing that we discover that no one else worked out. Why not? Because they didn't test for it. Like this is, am I the genius? Well, I guess, thinking to test the things maybe sometimes, but more often than not, no. I'm just someone with a system that I apply. And if you if you understand the general things that could be, and you test, you find what it actually is. Like it's as simple as that. And most of them are just not, they're doing it maybe Sometimes I see people with loads of test results, but they're all extremely specialized and all the rest of it. And as much as I don't agree with the terrain theory folks totally, as you know, if you know my work well with my Rejuvenate blueprint, like I still consider building blocks in toxins to be, root cause of chronic disease number 2 and 3 for a reason. Like they're right up there because, they're the foundational things that your body is built out of, that they consist of. And also that gums up the works and stops it working if your body's built out of toxins. And so we've got to kind of look into that and address that. It's just so fundamental. So yeah, test, don't guess.
Yeah. I mean, because that's the other thing too, especially with this one, especially with Jacob and with Morley, because Morley says don't do it and Jacob says yes. I mean, that's what kind of spurred me saying, oh, let's have a conversation about this, because like, they all have valid points, but which do you follow?
And Dr. Smith says yes, and Grant says no, even though they both are anti-vitamin A people. So yeah. Who do you follow? None of them, in my opinion, including don't follow me either. Test and find out for yourself. Generally, I prefer a blood test, urine test second, hair mineral analysis by all means, but that's generally considered like the third most useful test to actually measure toxic exposure or nutritional levels. But by all means, do all three. Like all three is ideal. And then you'll get an idea of what's actually going on there. And could it still sometimes be wrong or misleading? Yes, because human biochemistry is very complicated. But at least you're not fumbling around in the dark then. At least you've got a good idea, and then you just need to navigate it.
Yeah, okay. Now that's very, very, very valid point there. Right, so now we're going to move on to, is it a good idea to take omega-3, or is it a good idea to take cod liver oil?
So I think we did talk about it in the interview with Jay. He was anti taking omega-3, and he explained why. And cod liver oil, which of course is omega-3 plus vitamin A plus some other stuff, Morley recommended. So I guess, we've lumped those two together. So is it a good idea to take omega-3? Despite everything that Ray Peat says about omega-3, I still do see the validity in making sure that the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 does not become too high. So what does that mean? Even if everything Dr. Ray Peat, and I've said it several times, so I won't explain the whole thing again, but even if he is right in his basic view that the only reason that omega-3s are anti-inflammatory is because they really suppress the immune system in a kind of vaguely similar way to something that like rapamycin might do. Even if that is true, and I'm not saying it is, but even if it is also true that when you have a high enough ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, this creates all kinds of health problems. So, it's inflammatory health problems specifically. So I would say if you are absolutely meticulous about avoiding omega-6s, what does that include? You pretty much never eat packet food that contains fat unless you have checked carefully every ingredient to make sure it doesn't have any seed oils in, soy oil. Unless you avoid eating out all the time, you basically almost never do it. You never do it, and unless you are 100%, 100% aligned with your willpower when it comes to the food that you select within your own home, it's probably a little bit risky to totally avoid omega-3 because it's really easy to avoid omega-3. Basically, just don't eat fish and flax seeds, and who's accidentally eating flaxseed in this day and age, or hemp seed? Not many people. Where it's really easy to accidentally consume vegetable oil. Yeah, anything that's deep fried, anything that's basically any kind of oil and any kind of, as I said, package or eating out food is almost certainly going to be loaded in omega-6s. I am pretty, I'm unusual. I'm pretty thorough with my avoidance of omega-6s and have been for years. And again, I test. So in my omega-6s are not that low, but they are low now. They're below the reference range. And even better, the levels of the bad omega-6s like linoleic acid and arachidonic acid are below the reference range, but the levels of good omega-6s like GLA and DGLA are above the reference range. So I can be very happy that my strategy of largely completely avoiding all omega-6s is not causing a problem. I've got plenty of the good type of omega-6s. I've got a lack of the bad kind. Great. And so am I going to take omega-3 and cod liver oil or any of these kind of things? No. And I don't eat fish. I don't do any of it. And I haven't for years. And still, when I look at my levels of omega-3s and omega-6s broken down into all the components, I have plenty of EPA, plenty of DHA, good ratio of omega-3 to omega-6. I'm good. But so I'm not worried that I never take them and haven't for years. And it certainly proves to me that, I guess like we were saying about the vitamin A earlier, even if these nutrients are essential, by the time you reach adulthood, you can have, almost none of them for years and you're nowhere near running out. Like your body has a lot of it stored. Now, that's me. But what about the average person? If you're still eating packet foods and not meticulously making sure it doesn't contain any omega-6, if you're still eating out, all of this kind of stuff, you're probably having a decent amount of omega-6s. And so then should you also be avoiding all omega-3s because you heard on some podcasts that they're not good for you? I would be hesitant to do that. And I would be considering, is it worth eating foods containing omega-3 like fish, or is it worth supplementing in that case? It's tricky though, because omega-3 has the highest tendency chance of going rancid. And so even the people who are like pro omega-3, Morley recently recommending the cod liver oil, they have to admit that like the vast majority of them are horrible because they're all rancid. And so he has his recommended brand. I've seen other people who, promote omega-3. They basically, if you promote omega-3 these days, you kind of have to say, I'm a big fan of it, but almost all of them are garbage. And here's one I recommend. Like it's tricky to actually get a good omega-3 from supplement. To be honest, it's difficult to get a good omega-3 from food. I never used to understand why they would say, with supplements, you have to be really careful to make sure it's not rancid. But with fish, you can cook it for a while and eat it and it's fine. Well, actually, omega-3 is rapidly destroyed by heat. Once you're eating cooked fish, like that omega-3 has been substantially destroyed by heat as well. They never talk about that, but it is true. So is it ever a good idea to take omega-3? Maybe. And then is it ever a good idea to take the vitamin A version, which is, I guess omega-3 is actually, cod liver oil is more vitamin A than it is omega-3, but it has a bit of omega-3. For some people, that's why they take it. For the cod liver oil answer, I guess I'd defer to my earlier answer about is it ever a good idea to take vitamin A? It's the same answer. It's mainly a vitamin A source. But yeah, for the omega-3s, as I said, in theory, I'm for it if you are still having let's say, a normal but evolutionary, extremely high level of omega-6. But in practice, it's very difficult. And I don't, I stopped selling it on the site, not because there were any kind of proof that, like evidence that there was anything wrong with the omega-3 that we were selling, but just because I was not convinced enough that it was definitely, there was no chance of it becoming rancid before the best before date. Let's put it that. Like what was actually tested was fine, but it's such a challenge. So yeah. So is it good to take omega-3? I don't and haven't for years, and my omega-3 levels are totally optimal by testing. But I would say the better way to make sure you have optimal levels of omega-3 is to avoid all omega-6s as opposed to taking omega-3. And also, for me, it's easier. For me, it's easier to just avoid all the crap than it is to find a source of omega-6 that's definitely going to be good for me.
I know, but see, I'm the type of person to be like, yes, but Owen, every now and again, there's a really great bag of truffle potato chips out there that I'm definitely going to, and
don't they have a type that is made with coconut oil or olive oil?
I will find that one.
I'm pretty sure they do. I think in England, I remember seeing one that is truffle potato chips made with those fats. So yeah, just do that.
Perfect. Just do that one. Beautiful. Well, yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense,
If I could go back in time right now and hand the 30-year-old me one tool that would help save me 15 years of pain, fatigue, confusion, then this is what I'd do. I would give myself Advanced Health Genetics All Access reports. Now, unfortunately, it didn't exist back then, but if I could, or if I could go back in time and give myself the results that I've generated now, that's exactly what I would do. It would have told me instantly that I have multiple genetic SNPs, making me prone to choline, calcium, and tyrosine deficiency, among other things, lead and aldehyde toxicity, and bad histamine metabolism, which explain my brain fog, the IBS, the chronic sinus infections, the fatigue, everything. Instead of trying 400 random things, I could have laser focused on the top 5 things that actually mattered for my DNA. And that's exactly what this can do for you now. Over 500 reports, 200 million variants or SNPs analyzed with 99.7% accuracy, free lifetime updates, and the strongest privacy in the world. We're fully GDPR compliant. We anonymize your data. We store genetics and personal info separately, and you can delete everything with one click. We don't sell your data, ever. Try it now. Go to advancedhealthgenetics.com, and if you have an old DNA file, because maybe you've used an ancestry service like ancestry.com, 23andMe, anything like that, you can upload it and you have your first reports within hours. And if you don't, just select the DNA kit option. We'll send you a saliva test kit. It's really easy to do. Advanced Health Genetics is already by far the most affordable DNA reporting company of its kind. But if you use the code REJUVENATE at checkout, you get an additional 20% off your order. That's advancedhealthgenetics.com and use code REJUVENATE at checkout. Do it for the version of you that's tired of guessing. You deserve to know the truth about yourself.
All right, we're going to move on to our next question. And so this is with Jacob. Is it a good idea to do HG7?
Yeah, and this is the most common question I get, I think, pretty much. It's usually some version of, are you still doing it? And is it, if so, why? And if so, why not? So is it a good idea to do HG7? I think, Jacob, so this is Jacob's formula. We've had him on as a guest a few times to share his formula and his updates and stuff like that. And we had him on most recently to share his genetic results. Sorry, not genetic results, epigenetic results. And so let me talk about how one of his epigenetic results before I answer that. The podcast sponsored that episode. It helped pay for those. And the reason was, and I said to him afterwards, once we got the results, I said I wouldn't have paid for it if I felt that, it was going to show that you had like terrible health results. There's no way that I believe that was the case. I wasn't, trying to discredit you. But basically what we got to is pretty much what I expected. So I wanted to do it for 2 reasons. There are people who believe that it is, damaging and hurting him. That's the most common criticism he got. I didn't really think it was. And that's what was interesting to me. He took this combination of ingredients that if you'd have done them in isolation, really would have messed you up. And yet somehow with the specific ratio of the different ones together, it actually had at least no detrimental effect. And, quite possibly, and I think we're accumulating, more evidence for this, like with his results, a beneficial effect. But I think the most important thing to address for me is it actually going to hurt you? And obviously he'd be doing the largest amount, he'd be doing it for the longest. So if anyone who should have been, hurt by it should have been him. And so he was the right person to test. And he hadn't been, not in any significant way. In fact, given how appalling his lifestyle is, there's a different debate, whether he should carry on with that. I think the part that we've got to is he's agreed he'll test it one more time after a while. And then if it shows significant improvement, then he feels like his system is proven and he'll start to optimize his lifestyle as well. So fair enough. And so we kind of established, at least in his case, the n equals 1, the person who's done the highest dosage for the longest time, it wasn't damaging. That in and of itself is quite surprising, given a lot of people worried about the doses of vitamin C. I noticed in the forum. I wasn't. Linus Pauling was doing way more than that almost 50 years ago. That's fine. But, it's very high doses of biotin, more than anyone has ever taken in any study that I could find. It's very high doses of molybdenum, more than anyone has ever taken in any study that I could find, right? So he's really pushed the boundaries of biochemistry, of human biochemistry in terms of what is possible and what is safe for a human being to take. Even the zinc doses are pretty, in the EGCG, but at least there's some evidence that those would be just fine. There's zero evidence that I could find anyway that doses that high of biotin or doses that high of molybdenum were actually safe. And yet, I tried it for myself, and it seemed to be fine. And so that in itself is very interesting. And Jacob said to me before in private conversation, I don't think he minded to say this, he's surprised at the lack of interest in other scientists, doctors or whatever, as to why it's safe, even though it shouldn't be. And I said, yeah, these people are not easily moved, unfortunately, generally. But it is interesting. I agree. And it is surprising that these very high amounts seem to be at least safe. So is it dangerous? Obviously, every case is different. I've just said supplementing copper could be dangerous. Not having enough copper could be dangerous. Supplementing vitamin A could be dangerous. Not having enough vitamin A could be dangerous. So, of course, Jacob's formula is in that category of everything, which could be dangerous. I get that. But is there a high chance of it being dangerous? It's looking like the answer is surprisingly not really. Not as high as you'd probably think. So that's the first thing. That was the most important thing for me to address. Now, secondarily, is it actually a good idea? Now, with that, I think it is much more case by case. I have to say that I did it for a while, and I did experience benefit from it. More surprisingly, as I say, shockingly to me, I didn't have any detriment from it, like you'd expect. But I have always been a bit of an anomaly for several reasons. One of them is I've never done it and discontinued everything, like Jacob recommends. So in any way of it not working for me, I am not, that is not illustrative of the research protocol itself, because I never followed it 100% as you should by Jacob standards. I always was still doing other things. I didn't do other things at the same time. That's the compromise that I made. I would say at the time of that, because he his theory is it only works in the body for a few hours. So during those few hours, I would not do anything else. But the opposite end of the day, I would not have things. I would just do them at the opposite end of the day. So there's that. And then second of all, whenever I would ask Jacob about why is it that I seem to be so wildly different from your general recommendations in some aspects, like for instance, the lack of need of molybdenum by his standard, he would say, well, I think it might be due to the lead toxicity. And I don't think that is actually an unreasonable answer by him, because I keep bumping into, it's funny, I often go down this rabbit hole with testing. I'm a bit of a, curious person, obviously, as you said, Chrissy, and with myself and with my clients. And it's like, it's like a really convoluted journey, but what actually ends up with is, it's the lead toxicity again. Like, that's what always causes, not always, but usually causes these anomalies. And you think it's something else, and it could be this, and it could be, it's the lead again. It always ends up being the lead again. So the idea that his rules wouldn't apply to me because of the lead, fair enough. It's because a lot of rules seem to not apply to me because of the lead still being there. So that's reasonable as well. Honestly, just, with my zinc levels being so low, which is something that shifted after doing Jacob's formula for a while, my zinc levels actually ended up being low. There's various theories for this. One of them is that my body started to actually absorb my zinc levels being so low. Sorry. The zinc levels, being so low for the first time a few months ago when I started testing my blood levels more regularly. And Jacob's formula just wasn't helping to increase it. And so I started looking into other ways to increase it. And I won't do it, maybe that's another episode where I do, my own health update. But bottom line is I ended up going down another avenue. But that's because I have a very specific and unusual situation. Now, so that's me. Everyone seems to want to know if I'm still doing it. Right now, I am pursuing something else because I have a very specific and unusual situation. Now, should you do it? As Jacob and I, in all the interviews, always made clear, it is a research project. So, should you participate in a research project? There's definitely no should when it comes to research projects. There's only, do you want to? As I said, my main goal was to establish, is it likely safe? And it seems like it's likely safe, which is surprising. But obviously we can't guarantee that, and that is the nature of early research and a new protocol, especially with levels higher than anyone's ever tried before. As far as we know, that is always a risk. There's always a possibility that it's not a good idea for you. But it seems to be generally largely safe and a lot surprisingly safe, I would guess, given the high levels of certain things like the molybdenum and the biotin. And so probably the molybdenum is the more surprising one because biotin is a fat-soluble vitamin, a water-soluble vitamin. You would expect it to just be excreted if you don't use it. But the molybdenum, it can accumulate. And so, it is surprising that it's not more risky than it is, it seems. So should you participate in a research project? If you are curious and if if it resonates with you, one of the other many reasons I had Jacob on repeatedly is because other than, him, he's a discoverer. He's an inventor, he's an innovator, he's a discoverer, he's a pioneer. Is that he discovered that the correlation between a bunch of different nutrients and symptoms, which I'd never heard anyone address before. That seemed to be largely accurate, not just in my experience, but in a bunch of different people's experience. Again, he's discovering things that no one else has. So it's a quite exciting research project. I could see why someone would want to participate in it, but there's definitely no should, and of course you are taking a risk by doing it, as you are, I guess, by doing anything, but especially with this, because it is, pioneering means there's not that track record of knowing that many people have done it before and that nothing's going to happen.
Yeah, I as we've always said, and Jacob has always stipulated again, just reiterating, it is an experiment, and therefore, you are using your body and moving forward with that in that way. The thing that again that I go back to was not the balance, but the opposition of seeing the root cause protocol with Morley and where Jacob was coming from, of figuring out like somebody's come to the podcast, they watch those 2 episodes, and then having to decide, well, wait a minute, they're both valid, but they're a bit contradictory. How would they choose? How would they know which way to go?
Testing.
Okay.
Well, okay. One of them, if you test and you have low levels of copper and low levels of vitamin A, and there could be various reasons for that, but it certainly does happen, and high levels of zinc and high levels of D3, then you're naturally more inclined to slot in more with Morley's system. If you test and you have high levels of copper, high levels of iron, or let's say more likely ferritin, low levels of zinc, low levels of some of the B vitamins. Like one of my clients was like a classic, he did a Nutristat, which is like a Nutrival, which we talk about in here, but like the Australian version, that actually seems a lot better. It has even more information in it. And pretty much every nutrient which Jacob identified of his 7 key nutrients, he was like really low on vitamin C, really low on biotin, significantly low on B5, which is supposed to be quite rare, really low on molybdenum, did I say it already? High in free copper, like every single thing fit. So I recommended Jacob's protocol to him, and he did it for a while at least, because I'd almost recommend Jacob's protocol to him anyway, because he was deficient in every nutrient that that protocol contains, right? So that was a bit of a no-brainer. And again, this is why I say with the testing, and he's not the only one. So that was the extreme case, because you don't usually see, even, as I say, depleted levels of B5, but this person was depleted in everything that Jacob's protocol contained. So it wasn't like an obvious fit. But of course, that's not everyone. And if you are the opposite, if you're low, as I said, low copper, high zinc, high iron, stroke ferritin, you may well want to consider an approach like Morley's instead. I just don't think it's one size fits all.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great clarification and distinction for somebody, especially if they're coming in like, oh, what do I do? What do I do? Because in the health world, there can be opposing things out there, and people find it confusing. So that's also too the purpose of this episode, is just to help with that clarification.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I would say, if I had to guess, there were some aspects of, what both Morley and Jacob teach, actually, which are more male focused. So the focus on zinc. I see actually quite a lot of women, who are low in zinc, like you, Chrissy. But I think Jacob's talked about recently how he's kind of acknowledging that women still need less zinc in his protocol than men. Well, I'm not guessing. I think we did talk about it in the last episode with him. And then, Morley, men are more likely to have a toxic buildup of iron than women. So both of them, in a way, are kind of male protocols, although in other ways they're in the opposite end of the scale. And I would say I have less experience with Morley's community, but I hear firsthand that there are more like women who don't do well with it. And I've heard actually the same from Jacob himself. He's not hiding it about his protocol, at least the way it was initially. He's revised, I think, the women's version since. So that's, another confounding factor. It's not, obviously test results are the best thing, but if you absolutely insist on not doing tests, even your gender and age, like if you are a menstruating woman, you may well have a different nutritional profile. And basically, excess copper may be more likely to be an issue for you in relation to iron, and excess iron may well be less likely to be an issue for you.
Right. Okay. Yeah. No, that's good. That's clear. That is clear. I think we're also coming to time, but I think we have time for one more question?
Yeah, I'll try my best to answer quickly.
Okay, here we go. So our final question of the episode is it ever okay to take an iron supplement?
I hope if people watched all the way through, and I encourage you to if you skipped ahead to this, that my answer to this is going to be obvious by now. And it's going to be testing, Now, the only difference here, I guess, is, Morley added in an interesting confounding variable to this.
Yes, he did. Because that's what I was also going to ask you about, because I'm like, oh, wait a minute.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I have not come to a conclusion yet on this ferritin issue, except for this. Well, the key thing, and Dr. Miriam's the first one to really emphasize this to me, and I've not found any evidence yet that it's wrong. That the key thing when it comes to all this is hemoglobin, which is the kind of measure of the oxygen binding capacity of your red blood cell. And so if your hemoglobin is sufficient, and better actually, that's optimal, I am coming to the conclusion, starting to agree a bit with Morley, that like the ferritin is not such a problem. Even if your ferritin is below the reference range, let's say if it's 25, 20, maybe even 15, like yours have been, Chrissy, if the hemoglobin is optimal and the other markers around it are also optimal, that's secondary, but MCV, MCH, all this kind of stuff, that's really the important thing. Now, the one confounding issue with that is I have found often when the hemoglobin actually is low and the person actually is anemic, or maybe it's like secondary types of anemia, like the MCV and MCH are high, or different types. But let's macrocytic anemia, microcytic anemia, pernicious anemia. But those are more rare. So the more common one is just a normal anemia. if the hemoglobin, when I see people with, let's put it this way, when I see people with low hemoglobin, which is, again, not that common, but it definitely happens, again, especially among women of menstruating age, the ferritin is usually really low. So there's an argument that could have been made that if we'd have caught this earlier and addressed it, we would never got to this really, medically concerning place of anemia in the first place. So on the one hand, having a ferritin of 15, if you have optimal hemoglobin levels, is not necessarily a problem. On the other hand, maybe once you get to a ferritin of 10, you are going to start having hemoglobin problems. And I'm doing those two numbers purely based on anecdotal experience. For, maybe it's more, for some person, they might have a problem with hemoglobin at 20 ferritin or even higher or whatever. But the point is, there does get to a level where it does become a problem. So is it ever okay to take an iron supplement, given that maybe one of the only things that every one of our guests has agreed on is that too much iron is bad and that too much iron is common? I would say still yes. And it is, for that reason in the circumstances. But I was very happy to see that there was some agreement there, because I said to Morley, the only type of iron supplement I recommend these days is heme iron. It is that spleen supplement that I think you take, Chrissy. And he said, "Oh, I'm a big fan of spleen supplements." I said, "Well, there you go. that's so we can all agree on that." So it's more the inorganic iron, which is, well, I think he was calling it nail filings. I'd say it's, I don't know, like calling iron supplements nail filings or like calling calcium supplements chalk, I'd say is more accurate than calling, D3 rat poison, because at least it is a literal description of what it actually is. It is just ground up, iron, or it is just ground up chalk in the case of calcium supplements. So it is a fair description. And yeah, like the body doesn't absorb them very well. In the case of inorganic iron supplements, it causes lots of digestive issues and problems. There's a decent chance that it's going to be eaten by bacteria instead of absorbed by your body. And so is it ever okay to take an iron supplement? Absolutely. But I would only take the genuinely heme supplements, which are an extract from the spleen of an animal.
Brilliant. This has been really good and really clarifying, and I'm sure there's going to be, there might be a few more questions. So for anybody that does have them, please make sure you put them in the comments. But again, Elwyn, I do thank you for going over and giving your opinion as to what you find out, especially through the guests, because that's the other part. It's wonderful to have guests on, but as we have seen, sometimes, they look like they're in opposition, but sometimes when you get under the covers, you can see there are some similarities, but just different ways about it sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So is there anything before we close?
Yeah, you've really said about the questions. If you want to know my full take on things, obviously I share them in the podcast regularly, but sometimes I am, I guess, as I say, a little bit on the fence to, allow the room for doubt and all the rest of it. But I come to very specific positions and detailed recommendations in my new book series coming out, or maybe already out by the time this comes out. And so the Rejuvenate Blueprint series, the first one's going to be on genetics. To make sure you don't miss out, go to elwynrobinson.com or advancedhealthgenetics.com. Opt in when you get the pop-up, and I won't bother you with email regularly, don't worry. But what I will do is I'll let you know when each book is out, and it will be available for literally only a few days for a over 90% off price. So to make sure you don't miss that, to help support us, go and opt in now, and we'll let you know when each book is ready. We got one each of the Rejuvenate Blueprints, so one on genetics, one on nutritional building blocks, which we talked a lot today, one on toxins, etc. Make sure you don't miss that. I'd love to hear your feedback on that. I will take definite positions on all of these issues and many more. And otherwise, see you for the next episode, and thank you so much for watching.
And as always, lovely listeners, remember to hit that subscribe button and that bell icon so you don't miss an episode. And we'll see you next time.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed that video. You may have noticed I recommended a few different videos in that episode, and one of the ones I recommend is just here, if you want to click there, or another one I recommend is just below, if you want to click on that one and watch that next.